My name is Monica Wilkinson Kelly. I'm the archivist at the Edith B. Ford Memorial Library in Oakland, New York. This interview is being conducted as part of the Cuba and Seneca Lakes Agriculture and Craft Beverage Memory Project. Today is November 11, 2021, and I am interviewing Dave Peterson of Swedish Hill. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning.
So can you tell me your full name?
David Peterson,
Okay, and the name of your winery?
Swedish Hill Winery.
Okay, and where are you located?
Swedish Hills on Route 414, 4565, Route 414 in Romulus.
All right, well, thank you so much for participating. So can you explain your background, where you're from and your education?
Sure. Well, I sort of grew up on this farm, I guess. My family bought this, what we call the Swedish Hill Home Farm back in 1968. And a friend of my dad's was a grape grower for Taylor Wine Company. And my dad always was intrigued with farming. We didn't buy this farm for grapes or ultimately for a winery, but there were 58 acres of land on it. And his friend convinced him that he ought to grow grapes on the side. Since my folks had other jobs, farming was really not their first and primary thing. Certainly grapes weren't even in the initial thoughts when they bought the farm, but once they did, then the history began.
And I think I read your dad was not involved in agriculture, nor was your mom, correct?
No, they were, my dad worked for a school system, transportation and buildings and grounds, and my mom worked for a bank. And Dad's only real connection to agriculture was his memories of visits to his uncle's horse farm when he was a kid. So he always, I think, wanted to be what he called a gentleman farmer or a weekend farmer. Well, it turned into a lot more than that.
Well, and were they from this area?
They were from Western New York, Buffalo area, moved here to Seneca Falls initially, and then bought this property, as I said, in the late 60s.
And so when did they decide to make this career move altogether?
Well, it happened pretty quickly, I guess, once they had the land, and I think he was itchy to do something with the land. So by 1969, a year after we bought the property, they did plant the first 3 acres of vineyards, which were under contract to Great Western and Taylor Wine Companies.
And do you recall which vines were planted? What types of grapes were planted?
So the grapes that were planted were whatever Taylor and Great Western asked him to plant. So the first planting was Aurora and Catawba grapes.
Okay. And so how many acres altogether would have been planted at that time?
Well, there were three acres planted the first year. So then it was kind of progressive. Once he got bit by the bug, he wanted to plant more, I guess. So, and also had back in that first year, he was, they used to give an award for the best new vineyard planting of the year. And he got the award from Great Western for the best new planting by a new grower. So he was always very proud of that. And then they continued to plant grapes through the 70s. And then Taylor Wine Company kind of took over the Great Western Winery, which is where they had started with. And then that Taylor was, as a lot of people know in the area, went through a series of corporate buyouts in the 70s, which led to an unstable future probably for the company.
Yeah, I think I read that all of a sudden as much as 50% drop in purchasing grapes. So they were literally left to rot on the vine for some people.
Well, it was unfortunate as some of these vineyards just were coming into production. The market started to turn the other way for Taylor, and that was really the only substantial market for grapes at that time. So if you were growing grapes in that era, you were probably selling them to Taylor and Great Western wineries. And if once that market started to fail, there was no home for grapes. So we had some years by the late 70s and early 80s where we weren't able to sell our grapes.
Yeah, because it takes 3 years for grapes to develop. So you planted in 69, and so by 72, 73, you had your first real crop, correct?
Yeah, the market was in the early 70s was still good, but by the mid 70s it started to falter.
And can you tell me about, so when was the first crush, when was the first wine produced at Swedish Show?
Well, that was the New York Farm Winery Act in the late 70s led to small wineries popping up, and basically these small wineries were almost all orphaned tailor growers, if you want to call it that. People that didn't have markets for their grapes. So I think my dad kind of watched what was going on around him in the late 70s when some of the wineries started popping up in the early 80s. Shifted and planted a few grapes that were more for that new emerging market. That's when we first planted Chardonnay, for example, right around 1980 or 81. And he began selling to some of these other wineries. Well, that was okay for some of those things, but I was in graduate school at the time, actually getting a degree in grapes and wine from Penn State University, and that it was from that I was kind of talking to him about, hey, we ought to start a winery, Dad. That's what other people are doing. That's the future of the industry. Well, that wasn't his. He wanted to be a farmer right from the beginning, but my mother was certainly interested in the winery aspect. So by the mid 80s, they applied for a license. Had hired a consultant for that first year. 1985, the first wines were made at the Swedish Hill location, and the winery tasting room opened in 1986.
Okay, I think I read the first, you had 1,200 cases the first year?
Correct. Yeah, we started, that seemed like a lot of wine back at that time. And I remember coming back to visit, and I wasn't actually working here since I was still working on my degree, and I'd come in and look at these pallets of wine that they had bottled, and they were like, oh, I wonder how long it's going to take to sell this. But that 1,200 cases actually went pretty quickly that first year. So that was the beginning of what they didn't expect to see the kind of growth that they did in the early years.
So how many cases, I know you have different wineries, so we'll get into that later. How many cases are produced specifically for and at Swedish Hill?
Well, the Swedish Hill production is about 40,000 cases. It tends to be a little bit complicated here, since this is kind of our headquarters or our main production facility for our 3 winery brands. And we also do custom production. So our production is actually much larger than that 40,000 cases, but that 1,200 cases grew to about 40,000.
Wow, and this is an estate winery. Correct.
Well, we do grow grapes now on 4 different properties. So this farm has about 36 acres of vineyards. So some of the wines that are made here are produced from this estate. That being said, we have the other 3 farms where we source grapes from. We also do source grapes locally from about 12 other local growers.
Okay. And because you have these different locations, one on Seneca, correct? One on the western shore of Cuca Lake. So can you talk a little about how the grapes vary and how microclimates and soils would vary between those locations?
Sure. Well, every location is different from another location, and even locations within locations are different. So if you go back in the history, back in the Ice Age, or when glaciers created what we have in the Finger Lakes here, things have changed a lot. And the terrain was shaped by the glaciers, which means there's a lot of different soils that change even within a farm here. So there's a lot of Even within our home farm here at Swedish Hill, we see soils that change across the landscape. So we have very high limestone soils on this farm, and that is true of most of Cayuga Lake. But again, the glacier didn't just leave one deposit. It's very different as you go from farm to farm. And it's not necessarily just so much, is it different than Cayuga? Is Seneca different than Cayuga? It's really about the specific location that we're talking about.
Right. And going back a little bit, you worked, before you came here, I think I read you worked, was it at Cornell, is that correct?
Yeah, it's correct. Well, after I went to school for all those years in graduate school and earned a PhD in the grape and wine field, I decided I had to use that degree in academia for a while. So I actually worked in Missouri for 3 years and then 7 years for Cornell with the Finger Lakes Grape program here.
Oh, wow, quite an experience. And this is a family company. You have your wife and children, correct?
Correct. Well, my parents started it. They're now retired. My wife joined the business back in 2011. Let me back up. I joined the business back in 2006. My back up 1996, not 2006. And then my wife came into the business in 2011. And our daughter Amanda also joined the business about that same time.
So Dave, you've been in the industry for so many years. What sort of technological advances and changes have you seen over the years?
Well, there's a lot of changes that have occurred in the industry, both in the vineyard as well as the winery. So in the vineyard, I think we've seen things like incorporating weather data and modeling to help us predict things for disease management, which has been very helpful in reducing, say, the amount of spray that we put on a vineyard, since we're using actual weather data to know precisely when we will have to spray for a particular pest. There's a lot of things like with insect management, with scouting, that Cornell University has done a lot of work with things like establishing thresholds for certain pests. So just because there's a pest present doesn't mean we go out and spray. So we've used a lot of the research that's been developed there. Also in the vineyard, I remember when I was first involved in those first plantings in the early 60s, if you look down at rows of grapes, they're a little bit wavy as you look down the row. Today, our vineyard more recent plantings look perfectly straight when you look down the row. That's because everything is laid out it's all laser planted and using much more precise methods of planting those. It determines the depth of the planting of the vines. Everything is much more exact than the old days. So that's in the vineyard. The winery, a lot of technology certainly implemented as well in basically every aspect of winemaking. So it basically, we have more control over the process, both in the vineyard, in the winery, and make better decisions as a result of the tools that we have to work with. And there's things in the winery that, I talk about the pest control things and make us more environmentally responsible in what we do as growers in the winery, things that have affected how we dispose of wastewater, how we reduce wastewater, how we reduce water use in the winery. There's a lot of things that go on there. Our filtration technology has changed, and more reusable filtration means there's less disposal of waste, of say filter pads, because of a ceramic type of filtration cartridges and things that have been used in modern times.
And so what do you consider you mentioned pests, what do you consider the greatest threat currently to the vineyards in this area?
Well, there's an annual, I suppose, challenge in determining which is the greatest threat to how we do things. We deal with several mildew type of pests, and this particular growing season, for example, it was a much more humid, wet environment that we were growing grapes in, which was very different than what we had a year ago, where it was very dry. And, when we have a very dry, warm season, we have less pressures from mildews, but some of the insect pests can be greater in those years. So, the biggest challenges in most years, I'm going to say mildew pests. We have a lot better tools to work with, more precise means of applying a spray if we have to apply a spray. We also use some what called cultural means to control pests in some ways. Things like leaf pulling is something where the leaves are actually removed from the fruit area to create more sunlight on them. The grapes dry off faster, and there's less pressure from mildew pests when you dry out the fruit and have more sunlight exposure on it.
So how many people do you employ? Well, I guess we should get to your other wineries. We have, can you name the other wineries that you own and when you
Sure.
opened them?
Yeah, well, when I came back into the business in 1996, we bought another farm on Cayuga Lake. And that farm did not have any grapes on it at that time. That's now the location of Goosewatch Winery. So we started planting grapes, put a winery in at that location. So Goosewatch has become probably known for what we call walking the path less traveled. We utilize some of the less common grape varietals for the region. Some of them are historic old grape varieties like Diamond and Isabella. Some of them are newer grapes that Cornell University developed, such as Aramella, Traminette, and Noire. And then some of them are just maybe not as common in the Finger Lakes. So where Finger Lakes is known primarily for Riesling and Chardonnay and Cabernet Franc, Goosewatch doesn't really concentrate on any of those things. They do things more Pinot Grigio, which is common in the world, but not so much in the region. Viognier, another white of French grape. We do a few of the Austrian reds. We were the first to plant Lemberger in the region. Zweigelt is a newer red that we've added, also a grape originally from Austria. In addition to Goosewatch, we also have Penguin Bay on Seneca Lake. That's a bit of a mix of the two wineries. In other words, we do some of the mainstream varietals, but do some things that are a bit different too. That winery started out at the same time that the Penguins exhibit came to the Syracuse Zoo. So we developed a partnership early on where a portion of our proceeds of Penguin Bay wines goes to support the Humboldt Penguin exhibit in Syracuse.
Wonderful. So how many acres are at Goosewatch of vines?
Well, in all, we have about 85 acres of vineyards of our own.
Economic impact, how many people do you employ altogether at all of the wineries that we do?
So
Seasonal versus, part-time.
yeah, so we have about 20 full-time employees within our group. That includes the 3 wineries. And then part-time, seasonal, that varies. And that is a lot of tasting room staff, for example, to serve customers in each of the tasting rooms. Seasonal staff also includes some assistants in the vineyard in particular, with the tying and pruning of the vines.
And I think I've been, this year, as you mentioned, has been very uneven, very rainy, then cold, and then warm. So have you had any damage from this year's rains, in particular, flooding or anything?
Well, every year we get a different set of challenges, I suppose, to what, in some years it might be a cold winter. So this past year we had a very mild winter where it didn't really go below 0. So we started out the year off on a great foot where the winter didn't cause us any problems. We didn't have any frost problems in the spring, although it was close a few nights. And then as we moved into the season, we had an erratic season, as you kind of pointed out. We had some very dry periods, and then you'd all of a sudden get a week or 10 days of pretty wet, and then it'd dry out again. So I guess we were fortunate we had the dry out periods in there as well. This year's crop was unusually large. It might have been the largest crop that I just met with my vineyard team, and we were talking about the tonnages that we took off of our vineyards, and we believe it was the largest crop ever harvested from our farms.
How many tons?
So we did over 500 tons from our vineyards this year, which was a record, and was I think about 150 tons more than we picked the previous season. So.
And I see you have lots of awards behind you. You want to talk about some of your proudest moments? I'm sure there are many.
Well, it's always hard to pick one, but I mean, there's always landmark things, I suppose, for businesses that have been around for a while. I mean, I know how excited my parents were in their first year in business, that they won an international gold medal in Toronto. We had a very large competition called the Interbot International Wine Competition. So their first gold medal in an international competition was very exciting, I know. But over the years, Swedish Hill has also won 3 Governor's Cups, which is the top award for a wine in New York State. That ties for the most by any winery for winning the state's top award. So those are pretty cool. We also in San Francisco have won Winemaker of the Year 2 different times. Once in the 90s and once just a couple of years ago, more recently, 2017. So.
And you also have we didn't discuss, you have a tasting room in the Northern Wall.
Yeah, we have well, now it's a combined Swedish Hill and Goose Watch tasting room up in Lake Placid. So we do have well, not all of our wines up there, but we do have a selection of wines from both wineries that kind of gives us access to a different set of consumers. Although every time I'm up there, somebody recognizes me from down here, it seems like. So we do see some of the same people at both locations, but they tend to get visitors in some cases from different areas that we do.
Right, that's one major change. You mentioned the Farm Winery Act, which was 1976, that allowed tasting rooms to open and growers to create their own wineries, but it also allowed a number of satellite offices and tasting rooms and events and fairs and other things. So it really changed the industry.
Yeah, we've utilized that through the Lake Placid tasting room as an example. We've also done various wine festivals. Historically, we've had booths at the New York State Fair. We didn't do it this past year with COVID concerns and staffing concerns, but we've been one of the earliest exhibitors at the fair with a booth where we pour wines and more recently wine slushy.
How did COVID impact the industry from your personal experience?
Well, COVID affected all our lives in a lot of ways. We had to learn to be adaptable and resourceful, I suppose. Nobody knew what to do. In March of 2020, when a pandemic was declared, my wife and I were on vacation out of the country, actually, and we were trying to make decisions from there initially. But I think we had to shut down as far as tastings for several months. We did stay open on a limited basis as far as retail sales, although we didn't really have visitors coming to the area. It was local business. We had to try and promote our internet sales and direct shipping business. So we had to figure out ways to get better at that. We did more little video things as far as keeping our customers up to date with what we were doing in the vineyard, remind them that we were still here and that we were in business. We were surprised when we opened back up in June of 2020, how many people started coming out, and people were excited once we were able to reopen the wineries. We also utilized our outdoor space in ways that we never did before. Our decks and outdoor tables were basically there for people to grab a glass or a bottle of wine historically. Well, we started using them for tastings. And lo and behold, people loved it. So what did we do this year? We expanded our decks at Swedish Hill and Goosewatch, both increased the amount of tables we had outside, ran, weather permitting, basically all of our tastings outside. We also went to seated tastings even indoors. So while we don't crowd people at bars anymore, we don't do this traditional stand-up tastings we used to do. Well, once people got an idea, the feeling and had the experience of a seated, more relaxed, spread out tasting, whether it was indoors or out, we found out people liked it, and in most cases liked it better than the old style of tastings. So even though the restrictions have been lifted today, we still are moving forward with what we changed for COVID.
Right, some people, winery owners I've spoken with, said they may not go back to the old ways of more crowded, that they prefer the intimate and the pre-registration and reservation method.
It's created a different experience, and maybe one of the good things that's come out of this is it forced us to explore something. We all used to do the same thing. People lined up at the bar, a server poured them a wine, then come around a few minutes later with another wine. Well, that's not the way it is at some wineries, although some wineries have gone back. So people can get more of a range of experiences when they visit wineries in the area now.
Question I always ask people, what would you tell somebody who's considering going into the industry, whether it's planting vines, vineyard management, or trying to start a winery? What would you suggest?
Well, I'd suggest they do a lot of research before they make a decision like that. And I think that some people that think they want to get into the business are kind of swallowed up by the romance notions, the swirling and tasting wine part of it. And I think that a lot of people don't realize how consuming it is, how much work it is, how much effort that it takes to plant a vineyard, to grow grapes, how important it is to know what you're doing, how important it is not to get stretched too thin, to utilize resources, whether it's consultants, whether it's hiring trained employees. You can't just because you grew a few vines in your backyard and made a few gallons of wine in your basement that somebody said, hey, that's pretty good, you could sell that. There's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot of science in wine growing. There's a lot of science in winemaking. We have trained people with degrees in wine growing and winemaking in both the vineyard and winery. Our current two winemakers both have master's degrees from Cornell University in winemaking. It's not something to get into without understanding that it's a very complex process. And if you're going to do it commercially and do it well and make the best wines you can make and make wines that are highly marketable and will have a following, it's not as easy as most people think.
So I guess my other question, would you change anything? Would you do it all over again, or do you see yourself ever having anything differently?
I don't think anybody could look back at their lives and say they wouldn't change things in their personal as well as professional lives. We all sometimes look back at things and talk about what we should have done, but it's a lot easier to look back once you've had those experiences. So, I mean, we've made, every winery, everybody in any profession, I suppose, has made mistakes in their business. We've planted vines in the wrong varieties in the wrong location, or made management decisions with certain grapes that didn't make sense. Would I have changed my profession? Certainly not. I wouldn't have been in it this long if I wasn't fully committed and passionate about what I do. I think, going back to your earlier question, I mean, why, somebody getting into the business, you better be passionate about this business, because it takes that to succeed, as well as the commitment that.
And it's 365 days a year. It's out in the cold, it's out in the elements. And as you said, this romantic idea that you like wine, so you'll go into it. It's farming, and it's unpredictable, and it's hard work.
It's a year-round business. Mother Nature, either rewards you with an easy set of conditions, or it punishes you with a difficult set. And farming is not uniform in how it is. You have to adapt to that, and you just have to recognize that you have to evolve. You always have to be pushing to get better. If you're satisfied with how you're doing things and say, well, I'm going to do them that way again next year, it doesn't work that way. You have to keep striving to improve yourself, or you get left behind.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. Peterson, any final comments or opinions you'd like to express?
Well, I remember when I didn't have gray hair and was early on in the industry, and was looking ahead at all the things and all the predictions and things that I thought would happen in the industry. Well, some of them happened, and some of them have been quite different in the course of time. I think Finger Lakes is a much more recognized and reputable wine industry than certainly when I got into it. And I think the next generations will certainly see that evolution continues.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for all the contributions you've made to the industry. Again, this is Dave Peterson of Swedish Hill, and I appreciate your time. Today is November 11th, 2021. Thank you again.
Thank you.